Before dawn on August 7, 1944, a heavy mist settled into the valleys surrounding the French town of Mortain. The year was 1944. On the crest of Hill 317, a few hundred men from an American infantry division sat in shallow foxholes and listened. They were exhausted and had only just moved into these positions to relieve veteran units a few hours earlier. Their maps were crumpled hand-me-downs, and their telephone lines to the rear had already gone dead. Then, a new sound rose from the valley floor. It was not the high-pitched whine of American trucks, but a rhythmic, metallic clanking. It was the unmistakable sound of heavy panzer tracks grinding through the dark. The men on the ridge were looking down into a wall of grey vapor, realizing they were effectively alone against an entire German armored corps. If these men broke, the German army could reach the sea and cut the Allied invasion of Europe in half. And the question that would define the entire campaign was a simple one. How did a handful of trapped men stop Hitler's last gamble? To understand why these soldiers were left alone on a hill, we must look back 12 days to the moment the stalemate finally snapped. For 7 weeks after the landings in Normandy, the war had been a static, grinding nightmare. The Americans were trapped in the bocage, a landscape of ancient earthen hedgerows that turned every field into a fortress. Progress was measured in yards and paid for with staggering casualties. But on July 25th, the geometry of the front fundamentally altered. The breakthrough began with the weight of 3,000 aircraft dropping 6,000 tons of bombs on a narrow strip of the German line. General J. Lawton Collins, the architect of the breakout, did not wait for the dust to settle. He was a commander who favored speed over caution, and he recognized that the German line had not just bent, but shattered. Collins made the decisive call to funnel over 100,000 combat troops through a gap less than 5 miles wide. The American army had been compressed like a spring for 2 months, and now it suddenly snapped forward. Speed was now their only map. By August 1st, the front was no longer a line, but a race. The transition from the cautious mindset of the hedgerows to a reckless pursuit was total. American armored columns were pushing 30 miles south of their original positions in a single day. At the center of this momentum was General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was activated the moment the breakthrough reached the coastal corridor. Patton did not care about neat maps or secure flanks. He told his commanders to throw caution to the winds, prioritizing the destruction of the enemy over the safety of their own supply lines. But as the Americans raced toward Paris, they created a massive, vulnerable hinge at the town of Mortain. On the other side of the line, General Paul Hauser was watching his army dissolve. He was a professional soldier who could see the disaster unfolding, but he was no longer in control of his own movements. From his headquarters in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler was micromanaging the battle through a series of rigid orders. Hitler saw the American dash as an opportunity rather than a defeat. He believed that if he could strike west from Mortain to the coast, he could trap Patton's entire army and force a second Dunkirk. The German command was paralyzed by internal distrust, and no one had the authority to say no. Hauser was ordered to gather every available tank, nearly 200 vehicles, for a counterstrike. He knew the risks of attacking without air cover, as his panzers would be sitting ducks the moment the sun came out. But the order from the high command was absolute. This set the stage for the collision at Hill 317. The Americans were moving so fast they had not bothered to secure the high ground with anything more than a single understrength battalion. They assumed the Germans were in a total rout and did not know that 4 panzer divisions were pivoting in the dark. The Americans went from the expectations of a quick trip to Paris back to the gritty reality of a desperate defense. As the sun began to rise on August 7th, the men on the hill realized they were the only anchor left. By the final days of July, the American army was fighting its own weight as much as the enemy. The coastal gateway at the base of the peninsula became the eye of a needle. The entire force began to uncoil with a violent, mechanical energy. This was a chaotic surge where the primary obstacle was the sheer physical mass of thousands of vehicles trying to occupy the same narrow strip of road. The transition was driven by a fundamental shift in how the generals thought about the war. On July 26th, the Corps commander made a decision that many of his peers considered reckless. The infantry divisions were still entangled in the craters and debris of the initial bombardment. Instead of waiting for the roads to be secured, the architect of the breakout ordered his armored divisions to drive straight through his own infantry. Heavy tanks ground forward through columns of tired foot soldiers, intermingling units until the chain of command became a secondary concern. The war shifted from methodical progress to a state of decentralized aggression. This uncoiling was funneled toward a single coastal bottleneck constrained by two rivers. The geography was a logistical trap, with only two primary bridges and a handful of narrow streets that could support a mechanized army. By August 1st, over 100,000 combat troops were being forced through a gap less than 5 miles wide. The result was a constant grinding noise of engines and shouting as vehicles fought for space. In the town of Avranches, the congestion threatened to paralyze the entire offensive. Private Weiss stood in the center of the main intersection for 12 hours. He directed 3 armored divisions through the bottleneck, using nothing but a single flashlight. The roads were often blocked by burning trucks or deep minefields, and the standard procedure of waiting for engineers simply did not work. This is where the initiative of individual field commanders replaced the perfect plan. Colonel Doane was leading an armored task force at the very tip of the spearhead when his column stalled behind a cluster of destroyed vehicles. Rather than waiting for the traffic to clear, he put his jeep into gear and drove it directly through a literal hedgerow. He bypassed the wreckage to find a new path through the open fields. He was not looking for a road, he was making one. This aggressive leadership was the only way to keep the momentum from collapsing under its own weight. The congestion at the coastal gateway turned into a frantic improvisation of traffic management. Generals were forced to dismount from their command cars to act as traffic cops at the major intersections. They stood in the mud, waving tanks through and shouting orders to keep the supply trucks from blocking the fuel tankers. The expectation of a clean, orderly advance had dissolved into a reality where the most important weapon was not a gun, but a flashlight. This was the chaotic environment where Private Weiss found himself. For 12 hours, he stood in the center of the primary coastal intersection, a single soldier standing in a whirlpool of moving steel. As the sun went down and the rain began to turn the roads into a slurry, Weiss used a single flashlight to direct 3 entire armored divisions through the bottleneck. He kept the flow moving while the rest of the army sat idle in the lanes behind him, waiting for their turn to pass through the eye of the needle. If that intersection had stalled for even an hour, the entire drive into the southern peninsula would have backed up for 20 miles. By the time the lead elements cleared the Saloon River, the geometry of the war had changed. The American army transitioned from a cautious mindset to a state of reckless pursuit. Units began carrying double their standard gasoline allowance and abandoned their kitchen facilities to save weight and gain speed. The logistical friction remained, but the momentum was now irreversible. The German left flank had not just been pushed back, it had been bypassed. The Allied forces were no longer fighting for yards of dirt, but were racing across the breadth of France. The spring had finally snapped. No one asked for a second opinion. Once the bridge at Pontaubur was finally forced open, the American armored columns essentially evaporated into the heart of the French interior. The armored divisions were often moving faster than their own maps. This was a 200-mile penetration of the Brittany Peninsula that functioned like a cavalry raid on a continental scale. The front line, as it had been understood for 2 months, simply ceased to exist. It was now located wherever the lead tank happened to be. On the other side of the line, the German 7th Army was experiencing a total collapse of command and control. Orders were being issued to units that no longer existed, directed toward crossroads that had been captured hours earlier. The German commander was essentially shouting into a void. In the confusion, German officers retreating in civilian cars, often past American columns on parallel roads. Neither side was entirely sure who was capturing whom. This rapid expansion created a massive logistical vacuum. The further the tanks drove from the coastal gateway, the more unreliable their communications became. Long-distance radios failed due to the rolling terrain and frequency jamming, leaving division headquarters in silence for hours at a time. Supply trucks moved through territory that had not been cleared, driving like stagecoaches in hostile country. Drivers kept their wheels turning while dodging snipers, their supply lines resembling a moving train where both the sender and the receiver were traveling at 30 miles per hour. The burden of maintaining contact fell on individuals who had to improvise. Captain Miller, a communications officer, found his unit completely cut off from the Corps headquarters. He realized the only way to coordinate the next day's movement was to find a working civilian phone line. He did not wait for a patrol, but took a captured German motorcycle and rode 10 miles through territory that was technically still held by the enemy. He navigated by moonlight, dodging retreating German columns until he reached a command post and secured the necessary orders. For the men in the tanks, the experience was defined by the Brittany stare, a bone-deep exhaustion born of sun-baked earth and constant dust. They wore sunglasses and goggles even in the shade, their faces caked in a mask of sweat and grit. They moved through a landscape that felt liberated one moment and lethal the next. In some towns, a lead tank would smash through a log gate to clear a roadblock, while in others, citizens offered wine to crews who did not even have time to stop their engines. But this sprint was about to hit a wall. As the armor approached the western tip of the peninsula, the atmosphere of the unopposed dash vanished. They were moving toward the port of Brest, a city the Germans had designated as a fortress. The Germans had funneled their most elite units, including the 2nd Parachute Division, into these fortified port cities. The transition from fluid movement to a hard-fought engagement happened at the village of Huelgoat. The American columns suddenly found themselves funneled into narrow defiles and ancient forests. German paratroopers were entrenched in the high ground, using the terrain to turn the pursuit back into a tactical slugging match. General Gros refused to let the momentum die as his division approached the coast. He stood upright in his tank turret, refusing to duck even when snipers targeted the radio antennas of the lead vehicles. One bullet clipped his antenna, but he remained standing to signal that the speed of the advance was more important than his own safety. This collision marked the end of the easy miles. The Americans had captured over 4,000 prisoners during the dash, but they were now facing a garrison that had no intention of surrendering. The realization settled in that they were ill-equipped to crack a fortified city without heavy artillery. The sprint had become a siege. To understand the tension that began to pull at the American High Command, in the first days of August, you have to look into the minds of the men leading the tanks. The breakout was no longer a matter of survival, but a matter of choice. The Allied plan, written months before the first soldier stepped onto a beach, was obsessed with logistics. It dictated that the army must turn west into the Brittany Peninsula to capture the deep-water ports of Brest and Lorient. Without those docks, the experts argued, the million-man army would eventually starve for fuel and ammunition. But the open road to Paris was now visible in the opposite direction. The generals were beginning to realize that the original plan might be the only thing stopping them from winning the war. As the armor reached the base of the peninsula, a different reality became visible through the periscopes. The German army was no longer just retreating, it was disintegrating. To the east, the road to Paris and the heart of Germany sat virtually undefended. The American commanders now faced the psychological pressure of turning away from a decisive victory to chase a logistical requirement that might already be obsolete. This conflict was personified by General Wood, the commander of the 4th Armored Division. He was a man who lived for the high-speed movement of mechanized warfare. As his tanks reached the outskirts of Rennes, Wood realized he had the momentum to drive straight for the Loire River and cut off the entire German retreat. He saw a chance to end the war in weeks rather than months, but the orders from his superiors remained rigid. They told him to turn west, clear the peninsula, and secure the ports. There is a moment that captures the weight of this frustration. General Wood was found sitting on the bumper of a jeep on the side of a dusty road, his head buried in his hands. He was not wounded, and his tanks were not broken. He simply felt he was being forced to win the war the wrong way. He described the turn into Brittany as a blind alley that wasted the energy of his division on a secondary objective. He eventually complied, but the ardor of the dash began to give way to a sense of missed opportunity. This is the part of the breakout that the mapmakers usually ignore, the friction of command that happens in the quiet moments between the battles. While Wood was grappling with his orders, the 6th Armored Division was experiencing its own crisis of direction. On August 2, 1944, the division ground to a halt in a wheat field near the village of Medrignac. They had received a handwritten note on a piece of scratch paper from the corps commander telling them to stop and wait for further instructions. Thousands of tons of American steel sat idling in the tall grain, their engines ticking as they cooled, while the momentum of the greatest breakout in history was allowed to evaporate. Into this stillness drove George S. Patton. He did not arrive with a formal staff or a briefing. He stood up in the passenger seat of his jeep, looking for General Gros, the man in charge. Patton was a commander who understood that in a breakout, speed is the only armor that matters. He found the division commander and demanded to know why the tanks were not moving. When shown the informal order to halt, Patton told the commander to put the note in his pocket and keep driving until he hit the Atlantic Ocean. He prioritized the dash over the plan. While this high-level drama played out, the ground-level reality remained one of mundane persistence. Just a few yards away from where the generals were arguing, driver Kaufman sat in the grass next to his vehicle. He was not privy to the strategic debate. He was focused on the immediate requirements of a soldier during a pause. Kaufmann sat in the Merdrignac wheat field, sharing a tin of cold rations with a stray dog that had followed the column from the last village. To him, the breakout was not a tactical masterpiece, but a sequence of long, vibrating hours in a driver's seat, followed by brief moments of quiet in a field. His war was measured in the heat of the sun and the quality of a shared meal. He did not know that the decision being made 10 feet away would define the next 3 weeks of the campaign. The result of that meeting in the wheat field was a renewed, frantic push toward the coast, but the internal damage was done. By following the original plan to secure the Breton ports, the Americans had committed themselves to a series of grueling sieges that would last for months. The opportunity to trap the German 7th Army before it could reorganize was being traded for the security of a harbor that the Germans were already destroying. The transition from the fluid pursuit back to the grinding reality of a siege began the moment the tanks reached the outskirts of the fortress cities. The freedom of the open road was replaced by the claustrophobic tension of urban combat. The Allied command had chosen the logistical sure thing over the tactical gamble. The choice was made. While the spearheads raced east, the fortress cities of the coast remained like jagged glass in the American heel. To understand why the war in the west did not end in August, you have to look at the port of St. Malo. It was a medieval city turned into a modern nightmare. 12,000 tons of stone and concrete brought the American doctrine of mobility to a halt. Allied planners had underestimated the garrison by more than half, believing only 5,000 Germans held the city. In reality, over 12,000 defenders were dug into a network of tunnels and bunkers that turned the picturesque coastline into a killing zone. The heart of the defense was the citadel, a massive stone structure sitting on a rocky promontory. It featured subterranean railroads, internal ventilation systems, and periscopes that allowed the Germans to observe the American approach without ever exposing a single soldier. When the American heavy bombers arrived, dropping 1,000-pound payloads, the bombs simply bounced off the slanted stone walls. The infantry found themselves in a slugging match where the terrain was measured in inches and the casualties were measured in rooms. The fighting moved from the open fields into the darkness of the city's infrastructure. This was a war of shadows and satchel charges. Lieutenant Reed realized that the streets were too exposed to machine gun fire and decided to take his team into the only place the Germans could not see. He crawled through the St. Malo sewers, navigating the filth and the dark, with a satchel charge strapped to his back. His goal was a specific machine gun nest located directly under a local bakery that had been pinning down his entire company for hours. Reed emerged from a manhole, placed the charge, and silenced the position from below. This was the reality of the fortress war. As the siege dragged into its second week, the American command realized that standard infantry tactics were failing. They shifted their strategy from capturing the city to systematically deconstructing it. They brought up the heaviest weapons in the inventory, 8-inch guns and massive howitzers, and moved them into point-blank range. Sergeant Hendricks fired an 8-inch howitzer at point-blank range against the St. Malo citadel walls until the muzzle brake glowed red. This was siege warfare in its most violent form. Sergeant Hendricks was one of the men tasked with this grim work. He operated an 8-inch howitzer, a weapon usually kept miles behind the lines, but he had been ordered to wheel it into the streets to fire directly at the stone embrasures of the citadel. For hours, Hendricks and his crew slammed shells into the ancient walls at a distance of only a few hundred yards. The friction and the constant firing were so intense that the muzzle brake of the massive gun began to glow a dull, angry red in the evening light. They were not just shooting at an enemy, they were trying to grind a mountain into dust. While the guns hammered the walls, the German commander, Colonel von Olock, remained unmoved. He had been ordered by his high command to turn St. Malo into a fortress that would never fall. When a French official approached him to discuss the safety of the civilians remaining in the city, von Olock replied that he would fight until the last stone was overturned. He did not care about the utility of the port or the lives of the men under his command. He was a devotee of a doctrine that prioritized total destruction over survival. The colonel even refused to come to the phone when a local woman tried to broker a truce to save a 12th century church. The end of the siege did not come through a grand breakthrough of the infantry. It came through the mundane destruction of the water distilling plant inside the citadel. On August 17, 1944, after weeks of relentless shelling and air attacks, von Olock finally emerged from his bunker. He was freshly shaved and wearing a dress uniform that looked entirely out of place amidst the smoking ruins of the city. He surrendered with an air of insolence, having fulfilled his promise to leave nothing behind but rubble. To understand the tragedy of this victory, you have to look at the harbor itself. The Americans had spent weeks and hundreds of lives to capture a port they desperately needed to move supplies to the front. But von Orlok had used that time to systematically destroy every pier, every crane, and every lock. He had scuttled ships in the channels and planted thousands of mines in the mud. The strategic goal that had driven the entire campaign into Brittany had been rendered moot by the very effort required to take it. The port was a ruin. Now, we return to the mist-covered crest of Hill 317, where the men of the American infantry have been surrounded for 5 days. To understand the sheer isolation of this moment, you have to imagine looking down from that ridge into a sea of white vapor that hid an entire enemy army. For nearly a week, these 700 men had survived on little more than grit and the coordinates they whispered into their radios. Radioman Murphy crouched in his foxhole, whispering coordinates into a cracked handset, while German boots crunched the leaves only 10 feet away. They were the only thing preventing the enemy from reaching the sea and cutting the Allied bridgehead in half. They had been supplied by hazardous airdrops of medical supplies and ammunition, but by the morning of August 7th, their situation had reached a breaking point. The enemy's plan relied entirely on that fog. The High Command in the east had staked everything on a meteorological forecast that promised a heavy, low-hanging overcast to neutralize the Allied advantage in the sky. As long as the mist held, the heavy tanks could grind forward along the narrow valley roads without fear of being spotted from above. By mid-morning, the lead elements of the enemy thrust were only miles from their objective, and the pressure on the ridge was becoming unbearable. Gunner Stack stayed with his burning tank destroyer in the valley, refusing to leave until he could fire one last shell into the drive sprocket of a lead Panther tank. The men in the foxholes could hear the clatter of treads and the shouting of infantry just below the tree line, knowing that if the visibility did not change, they would eventually be overrun. Then, the capricious factor of the weather intervened. Around noon, the humid heat of the Norman summer began to burn through the overcast. The white wall in the valley did not just fade, it tore open. In a matter of minutes, the sun broke through, revealing the long serpentine columns of enemy armor caught in the open. They were trapped on the ribbons of road that wound through the river plain. One moment the tank crews were protected by a shroud of grey. The next, they were exposed in a landscape that offered no cover. The silence of the morning was instantly shattered by the roar of the Allied Tactical Air Force. Within an hour of the sky clearing, hundreds of fighter bombers descended on the valley. They did not just bomb the columns, they hunted them. Using high-velocity rockets, the pilots targeted the lead and rear vehicles of each formation, turning the narrow roads into mechanical graveyards where nothing could move. The destruction was systematic and clinical. The enemy crews, realizing they were defenseless against the rocket fire, began to drive their vehicles off the pavement and into the soft fields. But the ground that had been turned into a slurry by the week's rain became a trap. The heavy tanks, weighing over 40 tons, sank to their bellies in the mud. They became immobile pillboxes, unable to maneuver as the aircraft circled overhead. By the end of the day, the Allied pilots had flown 294 sorties in this single sector. The grand counter-offensive had dissolved into a series of burning wrecks and abandoned equipment. This was the moment the strategic weight of the war shifted for good. The failure of the strike toward the coast meant that the enemy had used up its last cohesive armored reserve in the west. They had gambled their remaining strength on a single rigid plan, and when the weather failed them, they had no secondary line to fall back on. The rout was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. As the pressure on the ridge finally eased, the men of the isolated battalion watched as the enemy began a frantic retreat toward the east. While the high ground was being held, the rest of the Third Army was already exploiting the opening. The focus of the war was no longer on the coastal ports, but on a sweeping drive toward the heart of France. By August 8th, the American spearhead had moved 75 miles in 4 days, capturing critical hubs like Le Mans. This was the true face of the breakout, a movement so fast that it outpaced the enemy's ability to even report their losses. The human cost of this transition was visible on the outskirts of these newly liberated cities. Corporal Gomez, a soldier who had survived the initial breakthrough and the long race south, found himself sitting on a stone wall in the center of Le Mans. The city was a whirlwind of celebration and chaos, but Gomez was looking at a group of prisoners being herded into a makeshift enclosure. He sat there for a long time, weeping as he shared his last cigarette with one of the captives. The prisoner was a boy who was barely 16 years old and looked more terrified than defeated. To Gomez, the strategic triumph of the breakout felt secondary to the realization that the enemy was now sending children to stop the momentum of a mechanized army. The failure of the counter-strike at the hinge of the front had cleared the path. The Allied command no longer had to worry about their flanks or their supply lines being severed at the coast. The war had moved from the claustrophobic fields of the north to the wide-open plains of the east, and the enemy was now in a state of total collapse. The question of how a few trapped men stopped Hitler's last gamble is answered by the stubborn refusal of a single battalion to leave a map coordinate. The road to Paris was open. The failure of the German strike at Mortain on August 8 did more than just blunt a spearhead. It served as the catalyst for a total reorientation of the entire American campaign in France. To understand how the stalemate finally snapped, one must look at the reflex of the Allied command in the 48 hours following the clearing of the skies over the Sea River. While the German leadership remained fixated on a map coordinate at Avranches, General Collins and General Patton were already looking past the smoking wrecks of the armored divisions. They realized that by lunging westward, the enemy had essentially stuck its head into a noose. The American command did not just defend its lines, it pivoted its entire weight to pull the cord tight. This was the moment the internal struggle over the direction of the Third Army was finally resolved. The logistical obsession with capturing deep-water ports like Brest was suddenly relegated to a secondary concern. General Bradley made the decisive call to limit the force in the west to a single corps, freeing the rest of the army to drive toward the heart of France. This shift was characterized by a transition from the rigid, pre-planned capture of territory to a fluid and opportunistic style of maneuver warfare. Patton signaled this intent to his subordinates with a simple directive to not be surprised. He was telling them that the plan was no longer a static objective, but a wide-ranging hunt. Between August 4th and August 8th, a single corps of the Third Army underwent a staggering transformation. The men transitioned from a southeastward drive to a northward exploitation, moving 75 miles in just 4 days. At one point, nearly 200 miles of French countryside separated the westernmost and easternmost American forces. This dispersion rendered the expectations of planned, orderly warfare obsolete. The reality was now a slashing pursuit, where geographical objectives mattered less than the physical destruction of the enemy. General Hayslip, the commander of this sweep, often worked in a vacuum of information, discarding thick books of reconnaissance reports because they arrived too late to be useful. He pushed his personnel to the limit of human endurance, knowing that every hour of movement brought them closer to closing the trap. The strategic irony of this moment was profound. The refusal of the enemy leadership to allow a retreat had created what intelligence officers called floating flanks. These were German units drifting into destruction because no one possessed the authority to link them together. The enemy command structure was paralyzed by internal distrust, while the American command was operating with an ardor that verged on recklessness. As American engineers ferried infantry across the river at Mayenne in small boats, the German rear was collapsing into a state of total capitulation. Communication nodes were neutralized, and horse-drawn units from a German armored division were being overrun by American scout cars before they even realized the front line had moved 50 miles. This brings us back to the question of how a few trapped men stopped Hitler's last gamble. To find the answer, one must look past the movements of the corps and the generals and return to the crest of Hill 317. The answer is found in a human moment, the decision of a single artillery observer to stay at his radio, even when his water was gone, and the enemy was close enough to hear his breath. Radioman Murphy was that man. For 6 days, he sat in a shallow foxhole, while German boots crunched the leaves only 10 feet away. He whispered coordinates into a cracked handset, his voice barely a breath, providing the eyes for the American reflex. Because he refused to move from that map coordinate, the American artillery could pivot with surgical precision, breaking up enemy formations before they could ever reach the sea. It was not a masterpiece of grand strategy that saved the bridgehead. One man stayed on his radio. By August 12th, the week of decision was over. The Third Army had completed its pivot, and the road to Paris was effectively open. The German Seventh Army was no longer an attacking force. It was a trapped animal, squeezed into a pocket that would soon become a graveyard. The logistical gamble of Brittany had been bypassed by the kinetic reality of the breakout. The Allied command had learned that leadership and momentum could overcome any institutional failure or logistical constraint. On the crest of Hill 317, The silence finally returned to the Norman countryside. A single mud-caked American soldier sat on the edge of a foxhole, his uniform stiff with the salt of a week's sweat. He reached into his pack and pulled out a canteen, opening it to take his first full drink of water in 5 days. As he tilted his head back, he looked out over the valley below. The morning sun glinted off the charred, skeletal remains of the panzers that had tried to pass his position. They were still there, abandoned in the mud and the hedgerows, while the rest of the American army was already 100 miles to the east, racing toward the heart of Germany. The trap was shut. If your father or grandfather served in an armored division or an infantry regiment during the breakout from Normandy, I would be honored to read his story in the comments below. The unit, the town, the specific vehicle, or simply what he carried home with him. Those personal details are the actual record of the war, and they deserve to be preserved by the people who remember them. Thank you for watching, and stay with us as we follow the road to the Rhine.